All right, we are back for part two of today's Notre Dame mailbag. I want to apologize to everyone at the beginning, and for those listening to this part of the podcast, you probably listened to a previous part of the podcast where I just kind of stopped right in the middle. We had a power outage in our area that cost us 2.5 hours, almost over 2.5 hours before we finally got it back. Been a very windy day today, and I was just going to go on the board and kind of answer some of the questions, but I really felt bad that so many people were able to get questions in that I couldn't answer. We actually had a couple super chats, and I was like, well, I want to get back on there today. We're not going to have an afternoon show today. So I thought, you know what? Let's get back out there, have part two, and get to those questions. So here's what I'm going to do. We have several. So what I was able to do is when the show was over, my computer went out, but I was able to get my MacBook connected to my hotspot on my phone, and I was able to use that to screenshot some of the questions that were left. I think I got most of them, but there's a couple that I may have missed that I'll try to get to. And so like I said, I screenshotted as many as I could. I got 2 or 3 super chats on there. So if you left a super chat, I'm pretty sure I got that. So what I'm going to do at the beginning of the show today is I'm going to pull up the screenshots of the questions that we had left, and I'm going to answer those. If you want to get another question up, feel free. We'll go. It's a mailbag, so we'll just go. If you want to get a new super chat up, feel free to do that as well, but you don't have to repeat any of those earlier questions. If I go through these, I got 4 different screenshots. If I go through these and your question did not get saved, you can go ahead and throw that in there if you want. If you want to throw new questions in there, feel free as well. But I wanted to make sure you all got your money's worth today, so to speak, on the show. So I'm going to get started and get to it. So hope you guys enjoy the part 2 of today's show. I'm bummed that the Heisman stuff was I was having some fun talking about the Heisman stuff, and that got kind of cut off right in the middle. But we'll get rocking and rolling here with some new questions. So I did want to start off with a couple of those super chats. We did have a super chat from Steve Rolfe, and he said, "Thank you for the super chat, Steve. By the way," he said, "I just read the Jagasaw article. Who do you think are the best pull blockers on the roster?" Well, one thing I was got to say, I was impressed by. I was impressed by actually during the postseason was I was impressed with how well Charles Jagasaw pulled. I mean, he's very quick, very powerful, very explosive. I think he's a pretty good puller. I think Billy Schroth is solid. Honestly, outside of that, I can't really tell you. We've seen a little bit of Emil Wagner pulling and folding. He wasn't super comfortable with it. He had his moments where he could see his athleticism, but I think Emil needs to work on that part of his game. I think what would happen with him is when he would pull, he'd get a little bit too vertical, and that would get him, make him stiff. And I want to see him work on that. But Jagasaw is very effective as a puller, especially in the Penn State game when he was playing guard. So I think he's probably the guy that's best at it right now. Ashton Craig's done a little bit of it, not a ton, and he looks pretty good when he's doing it. But that's going to be an area where Notre Dame's going to have to improve. And that's an area where we saw, I'll tell you, another guy that I thought was impressive as a puller this year when he did it at times was Anthony Knapp. And he was good at it because of just God-given ability. He's very athletic. He's very quick, so he was able to move really well, but he's also a real powerful kid at the point of attack as a run blocker. And that's one of the reasons that I'd love to see Anthony Knapp move inside, is because I think he can be a great movement blocker. Not only is he powerful at the point of attack, but he's really athletic for that position where you put him at center. There's some things you can really do with him getting to the second level and as a puller and on some different things. So that's definitely one area that I think the offensive line can and absolutely has to improve next season is in that type of those pulls, quick traps, different things like that, fold blocks. It's an area where they got to get better. I had another super chat down here from AST12321. So I think that answers your question, buddy, about me being able to get to that one. But I was able to screenshot that. But AST12321, thank you for your super chat. Says, if you had to pick one of these options to return to Notre Dame, who do you pick? This is an interesting one. 1, Brian Van Gorder and Harry Heastan. 2, Jeff Quinn and Autry Denson. 3, Chancey Stuckey. 4, Brian Kelly. That is a really tough question. So number 4 and number 3 are completely off the table. I do not want Brian Kelly back, and I do not want Chancey Stuckey back for very different reasons. So those are off the table. I'd probably go with number 1, to be completely honest with you. And the reason I would go with number 1 is because I'm going to cheat a little bit, because you did not say that they had to come back in their roles that they had when they were here. So Jeff Quinn and Autry Denson, I don't know there's no value added there. Jeff Quinn's a downgrade from Joe Rudolph, and Autry Denson would certainly be a downgrade from Jawan Sider and Thielen McCullough. Whereas if you brought Brian Van Gorder back, I could make him a defensive assistant coach, analyst, something along the lines. I said I'm going to cheat. And then I get Harry Hiestand back as the offensive line coach, which is certainly, in my opinion, an upgrade from a coaching standpoint in the offensive line. So that would, number 1 would be my pick. And you really showed that you are definitely a longtime listener of me in this show, because you literally put a guy that you could make a case as my favorite assistant coach with my least favorite assistant coach as the number 1 option, which made that really tough. But at least of the 4, that's the only one where I think there is some value added to the current staff because of the Hiestand addition. There's no value being added to those others. Quinn and Denson are downgrades. Chancey Stuckey may have been a better recruiter to a degree than what Mike Brown has proven to be so far. Significantly worse football coach. And then, of course, Brian Kelly is Brian Kelly. So that's a hard no on that one. So that'd be the answer to my question, and I'm glad I could get that for you. Domer Grizz, happy Friday. Other than quarterback, which position group needs to grow the most during spring practice? You could make a case for the D line. You could make a case for the O line. You could make a case for receivers. I think the group that needs to grow the most during spring practice, in my opinion, would be the offensive line. And the reason I say that is this. The wide receivers. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the offensive line, I don't know how much growth we're going to see during the spring. You're not going to have Ashton Craig. Billy Shrouth is limited. Anthony Knapp is limited. Christopher Tarrick is limited. I don't know how much we're going to see of Emil Wagner. He's not limited by injury, but it wouldn't shock me, since he played almost 1,000 snaps, that they didn't necessarily have him out there all the time. So I don't know how much we're going to get a chance to see really any of those guys out there where we're going to get to see a chance to have the starting offensive line there. Now, the same is kind of true at receiver, but with receiver, the thing I want to see there is like you're going to see the young guys get so many reps, and they need those opportunities. You're going to get a chance to see, Will Pauling a little bit, even though he's going to be limited. You're going to get a chance to see KK and Cam Williams and Micah Gilbert and Logan Saldate really get a ton of reps. And I think that's going to be beneficial for them to provide depth. The same is kind of true for the offensive line. When you talk about it's going to be a great period for, a lot of reps for Gerby Lambert and a lot of reps for Sullivan Absher, hopefully, and a lot of reps for, maybe even Matty Augustine and Owen Strebig and Joe Otting and those type of guys. But I don't know how many of those guys are going to really be in the conversation for starting jobs, where that could potentially be true for the receivers a little bit more. The other option is D-line, but that's the most compelling case, because, and I think you could make a strong case that that's the position you should go with, because other than Boubacar and Botelho, you're going to kind of see everybody else that we expect to see. We do need to see Gabriel Rubio take a jump. We do need to see, Jared Dawson get acclimated into the system, which he will. We need to see Josh Burnham take a jump. We need to see Bryce Young take a jump. I'm really looking forward to seeing Logan Thomas take a jump. What are the young guys? What about Devin Houston? What about Brennan Vernon? What about Armel Mukam? What about Sean Sevillano? Can those guys take a jump? So, Domer, my initial gut reaction is wide receiver, but I think a strong case could be made also for the defensive line, because at least there, with the exception of the Viper, you're going to see a lot of the other starters really getting a lot of chances to develop, and the depth is going to be important. And that's really why those two positions for me are over the offensive line, because those are positions where depth is going to be used more. And those are positions where that depth is going to have an opportunity to really be developed. But also the difference too is that defensive line and receiver, there's opportunities for guys who could be difference makers to get some more work, where I don't know that that's true on the offensive line. So that's my answer. I think you could pick either one of those two, and that's where I would go. Andrew Sakalowski, got a chance to meet some of your kin at the get together we did down in Miami, so that was great. Andrew says, who are the top 5 best returning rosters in college football? What team outside this has the best shot of exceeding their proven talent? This is a great question. And let's just say this, Andrew. I love this question, and I'm going to answer this question. But here's what I'm going to ask you to do. If you're able to watch this, Andrew, and I hope that you're able to see this. But what I'm going to ask you to do is, at some point in time, I would love for you to come back and ask this question again when after the spring, after all the spring practices, because by then we'll have studied the rosters a lot more, and we'll have had a chance to to really kind of dive into certain things and dive into the different rosters, and just we'll learn more about, there's going to be some portal transfers after the spring, some guys going out, some guys coming in, there's going to be some young guys emerging. But here's where I'm at right now with this one, and this isn't in any particular order. This is going to kind of come as they go to me. I do think Notre Dame is in that conversation. I don't know where I'd rank them just yet, but they're in the 5. Texas is in the top 5. Some other teams that just as far as just pure roster talent, I mean, if you're looking at the SEC, Georgia is in that conversation. I would put Georgia in there. I'm going to put Bama down on my list as a team in consideration. I think Oregon is a team in consideration. Penn State is a team in consideration. Nobody in the Big 12. Nobody. Clemson is going to be outside of that top 5. Clemson would probably be my answer, or one of my answers maybe for that second part, because I think there's going to be so much experience at Clemson that I think they have an opportunity. They're experienced on the offensive line. They're experienced at quarterback. They're experienced on the defensive line. Now you have a more experienced coordinator situation. Garrett Riley's now a year older. You bring in Tom Allen to replace Wes Goodwin. They're a team that I think that I don't have in the top 5 that has a chance to play like a top 5 team because of their experience and the fact that they do have a pretty good roster. It's just maybe not like it used to be, where it was a no-brainer Clemson was going to have a top 5 roster. Ohio State's still going to be in the conversation. I got to look a little bit deeper into who Ohio State's going to be, but my tendency is to keep Ohio State in there in the top 5. Again, it's with an asterisk because I got to really study them, but I know they lost a lot. They lost a ton from this year's team, but the reality is Ohio State recruits extremely well every year. They don't lose a ton of guys to the portal. The guys they lost this year were mostly guys that are going to the NFL. They have an incredibly talented group of skill players coming back on offense. Their secondary should still be loaded. I really like their linebacking core from an athleticism standpoint. Obviously, Arvell Reese won't have the experience that Cody Simon had, but I think he's a better talent. Their defensive line isn't going to be as experienced as it was last year. Maybe not even as good as it was last year, but it's still talented. It's still really good. There's a lot of really good young talent on that roster. Quarterback, Julian Sainz, unproven. He's still a really good quarterback. I said this coming out. He was one of those guys that I thought he got bumped up to 5 stars because he picked Bama. I don't think he was a 5-star quarterback, but I think he's a really good quarterback. I think he's a top 50 to 75 guy. That's still a really good quarterback. James Peoples at running back is a guy that I really like, and I know they got the transfer from West Virginia in there, but I really like the Texas kid, James Peoples, going into a sophomore year. So I think the big question for me with Ohio State is really going to be the offensive line. I think that's the part of their roster that I just don't know that I love the talent. It's not bad. And they did get a couple transfers that I just, I don't love their transfers. They're okay. The kid from Minnesota has some potential, but he's very unproven, very raw. The kid from Rice is just, he's solid, but that's really the question mark for me. But I just think there's so much talent everywhere else that I have to put Ohio State in that 4. So I got Notre Dame, Texas, Georgia, Ohio State in there. I think the next one for me is it's going to be pick somebody between Bama, Oregon, and Penn State. One of those three would probably be my next in line. I'm trying to think of who some other teams would be. I don't view LSU as being a top 5. I don't view A&M as being a top 5. Ole Miss, it's not top 5. Tennessee's not top 5. Florida's not top 5. Oklahoma's not top 5. USC's not top 5. Not Washington, not Michigan. I'd say the 4 I gave you: Notre Dame, Texas, Georgia, Ohio State, in no particular order, and then one of Bama, Oregon, or Penn State would probably be next. And for me with Bama, if I felt better about their quarterback roster and their quarterback talent, I'd probably put them higher. But I don't. I have some question marks about Alabama's quarterback situation that has me a little hesitant to just put them in there at number 5. And then, I love Oregon's situation, but they got a lot they have to replace from last year. Penn State's one that I think could make a case. If Penn State was better at wide receiver and better in the secondary from just a talent standpoint, they'd be much more of a no-brainer to put in the top 5. I love their skill talent at certain positions. Running back, obviously, is really good. Drew Aller's a good quarterback. I like the young kid that's going to be his heir apparent. I love their tight end room. Even without Tyler Warren, it's not going to be as good as it was with him, but it's still going to be really good. They got talent on the offensive line, talent on the defensive line. I like their linebacking core. It's not like great. It doesn't have the kind of depth of talent or overall talent or even high-level talent that Notre Dame has, but it's still pretty good. But that's what kind of keeps them from being on that next level. They can match Notre Dame at running back. I mean, they're loaded at running back from a 1-2 standpoint. They can't match Notre Dame 3-5. Their receiving talent is not as good as Notre Dame's. Tight end, you could argue, is a little bit better just because there's more numbers and more established, less injuries. Notre Dame's got more talent on the offensive line. Penn State's got more experience. Penn State has more talent in certain areas on the D-line. Notre Dame's in others. I think linebackers a very clear win for Notre Dame. Corner's a win for Notre Dame. Safety is one that's a little bit closer. Actually, you could even make a case that Penn State has better overall talent, top to bottom. They've got DeJuan Lane, who I loved, who they got a couple years ago. Obviously, Wheatley comes back from last year. I don't remember if Jalen Lane comes back or not, but Penn State's in the conversation. Give me Bama, Oregon, or Penn State, one of those three. I'm comfortable with one of those three. And then Clemson's knocking on the door as well. So that'd be my group, Andrew. That's a really good question, but I would love it if sometime in May, maybe June, you can come back with this question and let's address it and see how I feel then once we've gotten through all the springs. We've got a chance to kind of digest all the things that happened during the spring. All right, let's go to some more questions here. When Salty's bomb came up at this point in time, we got one from, let me go see here. Okay. All right, so that is the order we'll go in. So John A1, in 2025, Notre Dame ran a lot of quarterback power run plays with Riley Leonard. Given the shift in skill sets to the current QBs in the roster, would you call any runs to the quarterback? If so, what would be your top 3 go-to plays? So I wouldn't necessarily say they ran a lot of quarterback power. If you go back and watch it, they ran some, but they also just ran a lot of just wedge or quarterback zone, just like look like inside zone, quarterback sweep. But what are my 3 go-to plays in the run game? First of all, would I call any runs to the quarterback? I mean, there's always quarterback sneak in there, so that'll be one. I think all the quarterbacks have the athleticism to where you can still run read zone at times off the backside. That's certainly a play I would call, have no problem calling all 3 of those quarterbacks. It's just, you're going to have a different situation with them. I actually think some of those guys read zone better than Riley Leonard does, because Riley had a tendency to just keep it no matter what, where I don't think those guys are going to have that same sort of attitude about keeping the football. But I think that you could still run that play on 1st and 10 and gain 6-7 yards at least, and with a pull if they crash the backside. You could still do it on 2nd and 5 and move the change. You could do it on 3rd and 1 and move the change. You could also do some stuff where you're running your read zone, but you're doing it with that split flow look that we've seen them do a little bit last year, where the tight end kind of looks like he's going to cross block backside, but instead he just leaks out and You read that end. If he crashes, you pull, you get outside, and you've got a run throw option there on the outside. I think all three of those quarterbacks are athletic enough to where if they take the under route by the screen under by the tight end, you can keep it and pull it and move the chains. They can all do that. So those are things that I would do with the quarterback, but I'm not running like goal line power. I'm not running the wedge stuff with them as much from the gun. I'm not going to do a lot of those. The counter play that Notre Dame did with Riley Leonard, they ran a lot of quarterback counter, blocked very similarly to power, but counter and power from the same family, just a little bit different. They just hit a little bit differently. Counters to a backside kick and a backside wrap. Power tends to be more of a front side kick and a tighter backside wrap. Different backfield action a little bit different coaching point for the back, but same family of run, very, very much so. But you're still going to run inside zone a ton. I think Notre Dame's going to run a lot of that. I think you're going to still see a lot of duo, and I think you're still a lot of counter. I think those are going to be the three go-to plays. My only request for Notre Dame in 2025 is I want to see something that just gets the ball, a couple things that get the ball outside right now, to the perimeter right now. I want to see a toss, and I want to see a little bit more of the jet reverse type action to some of the backs. I would love to see that also out of 20 or receivers. I'd love to see that a little bit also out of some 21 type of looks and 20 type of looks. And the other thing is the thing about Notre Dame's inside zone is Notre Dame's inside zone is more of an off tackle play than it is a stretch play. Their inside zone does not really hit like a pure stretch like a lot of teams that run outside zone. So like when you watch Notre Dame run outside zone, does not look like when the Denver Broncos were running outside zone with Alex Gibbs. I'd like to see something that gets a little bit more like that, where it's more of a pure stretch play. I think you're athletic enough to do that now. I don't know that you were athletic enough necessarily to do that at Notre Dame last year on the offensive line. I think you certainly are now. And I would love to see them do that. I think you could do some really cool RPO stuff off of that also with your quarterbacks. So those are some wrinkles that I would love to see, some kind of toss, whether it be just a pure toss outside zone, or ideally when I run toss, it's when I talk about toss, I should say I like more of like a toss crack type of thing. Would love to see some sort of pure stretch and just some quick hitters, jets, reverses, things like that. So give me some wrinkles of that with inside zone, duo, and counter, and I'm a pretty happy guy with your run game in that regard. So good questions, John. Salty asks, what does Luke Taus need to do to get more time on the field? I think there's a couple things that Luke needs to do. Number one is big picture. This is the constant thing that I heard from people within inside the program last year was he needs to be more assertive. It's just like they're just like he's holding back almost, like he's afraid to make a mistake. And what I was told, people around the program with the defensive coaches, they like Luke a lot. They think Luke Taus is a really good football player, but he just didn't show that hey, I'm going to get after. I'm going to play 100 miles an hour. I'm going to play like my hair's on fire. And if I make a mistake, I make a mistake. And then you just work out the wrinkles or the kinks, and then you don't make those mistakes anymore. But he was so afraid to make a mistake that sometimes he would play timidly. And I don't mean timidly as in like he was afraid of being hit, but just he wouldn't just go. Just let it go, man. Just take off. Just go. Play with that reckless abandon that you saw in high school film. And I think part of that is that walk-on mentality for Luke, where maybe this is just me trying to play like, TV psychiatrist a little bit. But sometimes I wonder if because he was a walk-on that maybe he felt he'd get punished more severely if he makes a mistake. But I don't think that's true. I think the way the coaches view him, they don't view him as a former walk-on, the same way the receiver coaches don't view Jordan Faison as a former walk-on. They look at them as really talented football players that can help your football team that they need to get the most out of. And so I think for Luke, number one, is just let her rip, man. All the other stuff doesn't matter if he's not willing to let her rip. And then the other part is just being more consistent with what he's supposed to do. He was a sophomore last year, and he was a sophomore learning a complicated position and just don't know that he was always where he needed to be. And when you combine that with not playing with sort of the urgency, I don't say urgency is not the right word, but just the aggressiveness that you need to see. Like Don Schuler would make mistakes last year. But when Adon made mistakes, 9 times out of 10, it was flying downhill and playing hard. And sometimes he'd make mistakes and still make a play because he was going at it hard. Luke needs to learn from that. And then obviously, as the season wore on, Adon made fewer and fewer mistakes as he got more and more experience. Luke needs to be like that. And if he can do that and do those two things, then I think he's got a chance to play more because they love the range. They love the football IQ. They love the athleticism. They love the ability to hit and cover and do all those type of things. So staff loves Luke Talents. It's just Luke's got to just let her rip. That's going to be really the big thing for him if he's going to really force his way into the rotation this year. Next question is from Salty. Where will the Irish cornerback group rank amongst all teams this season? Great question. If you're going to talk about the starting cornerbacks, that's a different conversation. That to me is a no-brainer top 5 caliber room. I can't say top 5 for sure because I couldn't name every single cornerback room in college football. I'm familiar with enough of them to feel good about putting them in the top 5. The question about definitely putting them in the top 5 and saying, like I said, like the starters, I'm comfortable with the top 5. But why I'm not as comfortable saying that the whole room is because right now, behind Leonard Moore and Christian Gray is a bunch of guys that have never played a meaningful down of football at corner. You're going to have Carson Hobbs, talented player, long, fast, athletic, strong, still kind of raw, but has never played a meaningful snap of football in college. You've got Dallas Golden and Mark Zachary and Cree Thomas, who are all really talented football players with incredibly high ceilings, loads of talent, but they're high school kids right now. Actually, I should say Cree's not a high school kid anymore. He's on campus, but Dallas and Mark are still in high school. And so they're not going to get here till the summer. And then maybe you get Chance Tucker back. He's coming back from the knee injury that he had last year, which is pretty significant. He's another guy that's now been in the system for a while, but he's never played a meaningful snap. He's never had to be the guy. And that's the concern that I have for the cornerback room is just that lack of experience, that you have behind the two starters. So starting group, I feel comfortable putting in the top 5, although I always leave room to say, hey, listen, I got to still study the rest of the rosters a little bit more. And that could change. It could mean I say, hey, you know what? Said everybody else, they're number 1. Could mean, hey, they're number 5. Could mean, hey, it's a great year at corner, it's 7th or 8th. I feel comfortable, though, that there's not going to be more than 5 better than them. The rest of the room is the big question mark. You're an injury away from having to play somebody that's never played a meaningful down of football. That doesn't mean they won't be good because, as we've seen with Notre Dame in recent years, when freshman corners under Mike Mickens have been thrust into the starting lineup, they handle themselves very well. And that goes all the way back to Clarence Lewis all the way back in 2020. When he was thrust into the starting lineup because of some issues with Tariq Bracy, he played his tail off. He didn't have the talent of a Benjamin Morrison and a Christian Gray and a Leonard Moore when they were thrust into the field, so they played better than he did. But he held his own on a team that made the college football playoff. And then obviously you have 2022, you had Benjamin Morrison, 2023. Christian Gray and Jaden Mickey play a bunch. Or 2022, you had Benjamin Morrison and Jaden Mickey because Jaden played a bunch. 23, you have Christian Gray. And then, of course, 24, you have Benjamin Morrison. So there's a track record of freshmen coming in and helping out right away. The difference is that in my opinion, your best freshman, Dallas Golden, didn't play a ton of corner in high school. He was a two-way guy, played some safety, played some running back, played some corner, played some receiver. He didn't have the experience playing the position as maybe some others. Mark Zachary is a very talented kid. Is he going to be strong enough to play as a freshman? That's a legitimate concern. Cree Thomas could maybe help you out as a freshman. So there's some guys that can help you, but when you're too deep, has to have a freshman, which right now with Chance Tucker out is a fact. I mean, right now, if you look at the scholarship corners, unless they move Bronte Johnson out to corner permanently, which I think would make a lot of sense for the depth chart, but would stink for him because I really want to see him at safety. Your two deep's going to have Cree Thomas in it just because you have to. And although I think Cree is more than capable of playing as a freshman, as I said a bunch of times, you want to play freshmen because they earn it, not because you have to play them because you don't have the numbers. And so that's where I'm hesitant to say the whole room belongs in the top 5. I got to see a little bit more of what some other teams have. I may find out that the best cornerback rooms in the country have the same exact problem. I got to do a little bit more research on the rest of the country before I'm real comfortable saying, hey, this is where they are as an entire room. More comfortable with the starters. Another one from Salty Virginia Peanuts. How remarkable was Brock Bowers' performance for the Raiders last season? Honestly, Salty, I can't really comment on that because I don't watch the NFL. And so I couldn't even tell you. I'm looking up his numbers now. I couldn't even tell you what his stats were. I'm going to look because it would be interesting to see kind of how he did. But 112 catches, 1,194 yards, 5 touchdowns in 17 games. That's a heck of a performance. So statistically, that's outstanding. He had 4 games with over 10 or more catches, and then another 2 games with 9. So he had 2 games with over 100 yards. So, yeah, statistically outstanding season. I don't know how good it was because, as I said, I didn't watch the NFL. But, I mean, statistically, I have a hard time believing that he wasn't outstanding just because of the numbers. You know what I mean? So here's another thing I like about just looking at the numbers. According to ESPN, he was targeted 153 times, which means he caught a pass on 73.2% of the times he was targeted. If that's an accurate target number, that's an outstanding performance. Like, that means when you throw the ball to him, there's a really high probability that he's going to do something that he's going to make a play, that you're going to get something positive out of it. And that's obviously not always the case. I'm very curious to see what the rate would be for a couple of the top tight ends. So he was the leading pass catcher tight end. Wow, that's impressive. Let's look at some of these other guys. So the next, Trey McBride. Actually, he had a pretty high success rate too at tight end. He was at 75.5. See what George Kittle's was. Looks like he's going to be pretty high as well. So 82.83%. Oh boy, that's really, really good. So it looks like that's more common in the NFL than maybe in college. So that's an interesting number. The next tight end was 79.3. So that's an impressive number, but it looks like, looking at other tight ends, that's the norm that tight ends do in the NFL, is that 70 to 80% rate. That's really impressive. Sam Laporta had a good season. Was he a rookie last year? Was he a rookie of the year? He was a rookie the year before, right? He's in year 2. He's a 72.3. So Brock was slightly ahead of him. Tucker Kraft is another guy that finished in the top 50 in catching. He was at 71.4. So he was kind of right in the middle there. That's still a pretty good number in my opinion for a rookie, especially with what I know that they have at quarterback. Like I said, I don't watch the NFL, but I am very familiar with the fact that the Raiders had Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell playing quarterback last year. Desmond Ridder for a time. So that's a little different than when you look at some of these other tight ends that are getting thrown passes by Kyler Murray and Brock Purdy. I don't think Brock Purdy's a great quarterback, but he's accurate. Tua Tagovailoa, Pat Mahomes, Jared Goff. So a little different quarterback situation for him than maybe some others. But so I can talk to you about some numbers, but I really can't evaluate the performance because I don't watch the NFL. Salty also has, who has the higher ceiling, KK Smith or Micah Gilbert? Salty, that's a great question, but honestly, it depends on what you're looking for. And you could argue, okay, who has the higher ceiling, Will Fuller or Michael Floyd? And my answer would be, well, what kind of receiver are you looking for? Are you looking for a guy that can stretch the field and be a big play weapon for you? Well, then the guy that has the higher ceiling with that need for your team is going to be Will Fuller. Are you looking for more of a volume pass catcher, a guy that's your number one, your boundary guy, or your guy that's just more of going to be your primary focal point? Well, then that's going to be Michael Floyd. If so, both of those guys had 4.5-star upside grades. It just depends on what kind of player you're looking for. I would lean towards Micah Gilbert just because I like the size. I prefer the guy that's more of the volume player just overall. You always want the big play weapons, but just for me, my personal preference, I like guys that can do a little bit more of everything. They tend to be more impactful on a consistent basis. He brings size to the table where he could be a good run blocker as well. So I'd lean towards Micah Gilbert, but KK's got a lot of talent as well. So he's a guy that both of them I like a lot. Both of them I gave 4.5-star upside grades to. Micah graded out higher coming out because he's just more solid, more proven. And then And then obviously he's got a little better injury track record, and then just that size he brings to the table. Archer asked how big is Gilbert. He's listed at 6'2", 208. He's a very strong built kid. He'll be probably 212, 215 this season, I would imagine. He's a really well put together kid. And then Salty asks, can Mike Martin bring anything new and effective to wide receiver? I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure that anytime you get a new voice, a new pitch, a new person that's selling the vision of what you're trying to do to the room, it can be effective. Is it, as far as is it new other than just he's new? I don't know that that's the case. I think the one thing that I would be interested to see what Mike Martin does is how much does he sell, how effectively they evaluated and drafted at receiver in Detroit. And, you look at Amon-Ra St. Brown, the success he had this past season. He was a guy that had over 1,000 yards this season. For the Lions, he had over 100 catches. They also had Jameson Williams, who had over 1,000 yards this past season at wide receiver. He was obviously another guy that they drafted. So they've done well with pass catchers. They drafted Sam Laporta at tight end. So, I mean, they've done a pretty good job with him as part of that organization at drafting pass catchers. Jahmyr Gibbs is a running back also. I mean, as a guy that went out and had really good pass game numbers. I think he was the 4th or 5th on their team in catches. Amon-Ra St. Brown was also very productive the year before. So there's some guys that they've been able to kind of identify and target that have been able to be really successful football players. And most of the guys they've had have like their top guys are guys that they drafted. They've had some other guys, Khalif Raymond, Josh Reynolds, that were guys that were either free agents or trade guys. But the guys they've drafted have been, so far, pretty good players. They've drafted some pretty good players, especially this past season. We have 2,000-yard receivers. So I think it's just selling that. I don't know if there's like something new that he brings to the table other than just a new voice, primarily a new person to sell the vision. Salty asks, what is the typical structure of a spring practice? How many periods are there, and what do they do in them? I mean, Salty, that's a very vague question, and it's hard to answer that because they have different practice emphases every day. They'll have a couple that are an hour long. Some will be a couple hours long. They're going to vary the length. I've been told they're going to vary the length of practices. That's always true. The general structure is you start off with some sort of stretch, getting yourself warmed up. After that, they tend to go to some sort of this is what they've done in the past. They go to some sort of team circuit, whether it's turnover circuit. A lot of times it's a special teams thing. You'll see the quarterbacks go down and throw. You see the offensive linemen go out there and do their thing while the rest of the team is working on some sort of special teams drill, some sort of turnover circuit, one of those two things. Then they'll go to individual, which is a period where they go to their position coaches. So you'll see, and sometimes they'll work together. So sometimes an individual, you'll see quarterbacks and running backs working together on different handoff actions. You may see the quarterbacks and receivers doing some different things where they're working on some actions. You may see the slot receivers go down there and work on jet action because they're going to work on that and practice that day. Then they'll usually get down to some sort of throwing scenario with the skill players as the offensive linemen work on some sort of inside run scenario. So like whether it's half field reads, one-on-ones, they do this drill where they'll have 4 receivers going at a time, 4 quarterbacks going at a time to get a lot of working on that. They'll then, do some sort of 7-on-7. They'll do some sort of team run. They'll have some sort of team period. And then some sort of special teams period is normally how the structure of those practices go. Used to be back in the day, heck, even when I coached 10 years ago, that practice always ended with some sort of conditioning deal. Notre Dame doesn't do that anymore. A lot of teams don't do that anymore. Your conditioning comes from the tempo of practice. And that's what they do. But that's the best thing I can answer. And then obviously if it's only an hour long, there's a lot of that stuff's going to get cut out. During the spring, you won't have as much. The team stuff usually isn't as aggressive and physical it is in the fall as well. That's another thing that's a little different for the spring. YouTube user, I love that, and it still says that for Salty Virginia Peanuts. I have no idea why. But Salty says, Brian, what was the favorite part of your vacation cruise? Well, the favorite part was just being able to be around my family. We didn't spend a ton of time together because I just wanted to kind of relax, but meaning like we weren't together all the time, but we did dinner every night. And it was my sister and her family weren't always there, but my parents were always there, and Angela and I were always there, and that was really nice. It was got to see my Uncle Bruce, and several of my aunts were there, so that was nice. Some of my cousins I haven't seen in a while, and then of course hanging out with my nieces and nephew was a lot of fun. But then there's also a lot of times there's just Ange and I doing stuff together, and that's always nice, where we're not at home, we're not thinking of, so I was telling her, she's like, it's funny, she actually worked a little bit during the cruise, and she's like, I was able to focus more on work when I was on the cruise than I'm at home. Why do you think that is? And she was kind of upset about it and mad at herself for it. So, well, listen, when you're at home, you've got all these other things to think about, because we're both business owners. So we both work at home. And I was like, at home, you've got to worry about, have the dogs gone out? Have they gotten their meds? I mean, has Rita gotten her medicine? Have they been fed? They have their, okay, I want to be pet right now things. You've got to deal with, oh, shoot, I've got to get laundry done. I've got to do dishes. I've got to make dinner. We both have those things. And so there's just a lot more distractions when you're working from home than when you're just on a cruise ship, where you don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about making your bed. Somebody else does that. You don't have to worry about cooking food or doing dishes. Somebody else does that. So it allows you to just kind of focus on it. And then, that's really what it was. It's just that quality time, being able to relax and just do nothing, man. I'll tell you, Salty, that was a real nice part. I just, being able to sit on the top of the ship and look out over the ocean as I'm thinking through different business plan ideas and other things like that was really nice. Being able to just sit out on the balcony of the ship, from our room, and just hear the waves crashing. So that's always been something that's very comforting. I have a tough time sleeping in quiet. I gotta have I gotta have a TV on. I gotta have my something playing. Even if it's something simple as a fan that's got some loudness, I have a hard time sleeping in quiet, because when it's quiet, my mind works like overdrive, and it sucks. But one thing that helps me is I'll put my YouTube on, and I'll put on like 10 hours of like ocean waves or something like that. And that started, so my in between my end of my freshman year, after my freshman year of high school, my family and I had to move to a campground down by the beach, because my dad had lost his job, and so him and my mom were working at this campground. I think it's called Travel Park down in Virginia Beach. And so we actually, it's kind of wild. During the summer, it's kind of cool, but so my sister and I stayed in the tent. We had like a bed, dresser. My parents slept in the van. We had in the pop-up trailer outside of the van. And it was cool during the summer because, there's different people, different girls kind of every weekend. It was a lot of fun. And then once that was over, it was a little bit tough. And then eventually we got an efficiency apartment down by the beach, and a little tiny 2-bedroom efficiency apartment. And I just would have trouble sleeping, and I just go sit on the front porch. And we were close enough to where I could hear the waves crashing. So sometimes I would just open my window, and the sound of the waves would really help me to calm down. And so that just has always been something that helps me sleep. So, and rest my mind. So I was able to be out on the deck and just listen to that. And just was really peaceful, really relaxing, just kind of listening to the waves and listening to the water hit the ship and all those type of things. So, being able to do that and it be a more natural sound was something that was really relaxing and really helped relieve a lot of the stress that I've been dealing with. I went into that cruise incredibly stressed out, and you come back and a lot of those stressors are still there, but even now I find myself just a little bit more at peace than I was then. And of course, anytime you're kind of just out in God's creation, I always just remember and appreciate just how amazing he is. And that was always a good part of it too, man. But I appreciate you asking that. But wish I could say the food, but the food was solid. It wasn't as good as the last cruise we went on, which was like 14 years ago. And then Florida Irishman has a question. Thank you for this. I've believed since day one that Adon Schuler would follow the same trajectory as Harrison Smith. Do you agree that Adon and Harrison have similar games and Adon could become a first-round pick? I don't know that I can speak to the first-round pick part. I have my doubts just because Safeties don't often go in round one. You don't see a ton of safeties going around one. You'll see some, but you don't. It's it's kind of like tight end, running back. Not quite as bad as running back, but there'll be some years where you may not even see a safety going round one. And their games are somewhat similar. I'd say that's fair. The difference is I think Harrison Smith is more athletic. I think one of the things that was most underrated about Harrison Smith is that he's a really good athlete. And I don't think that was ever truly appreciated at Notre Dame, and I don't think it's appreciated of what made him so good in the NFL. Harrison Smith is a really good athlete. He's 6'2". He's over 210 pounds. He's kind of long. He ran a 4.57, which a lot of people talk about, but he had a 34-inch vertical. But he's a guy that had a 6.63 three-cone drill and a 4.12 shuttle at 6'2". Those are really good times. Like, that means he has elite change of direction ability. No, he's not a burner, but he has elite change of direction ability and an elite get off. And those are things that allow him to, and you do that in a 6'2", 215 pound, over 32.5-inch arm body. That's going to be special. I don't know that Adon has that same physical makeup as what Harrison did, which could make it a little tougher for him to be a first-round pick. But, I think Adon Schuler absolutely has a chance to be an NFL football player. I do believe that. I've seen guys play in the NFL that don't have his God-given ability and football IQ and toughness and all that. He's got a lot of areas to improve on, just like all sophomores do. But he's a really good football player. But I don't know that I see first-round pick, but I tell you that, as I've said a bunch of times, as sort of more of a fan of the draft than someone who pretends to be a draft expert. That's not a shot at anybody. I'm saying that about myself. I don't pretend to be a draft expert. There are draft experts out there. I'm not one of them. John A1, Notre Dame is really starting to show its depth of talent. Do you believe the roster is trending to a point like OSU 15, Florida State 13, where you look at the two deep years down the road and see 80 to 90% in the NFL? You're talking about the starting lineup in the two deep. We've seen years where that's been the case for Notre Dame in the past. I certainly think they're heading in that direction to be 80, 90% in the NFL. Absolutely. If you look at the two deep this year, if you think about it, I think you'll see Riley Leonard in the NFL at some point in some capacity. You'll see Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price in the NFL. I think Bo Collins will have a shot to make an NFL roster, at the very least be on somebody's practice squad. Jaden Greathouse, I think, will be an NFL player. Mitchell Evans will probably get drafted. Anthony Knapp, I think, will eventually be an NFL player. Billy Schrouth will be an NFL player. Emil Wagner has a shot to be an NFL player. Rocco Spindler has a shot to be an NFL player. Then you look at the two deep, Jagasol and potentially Absher. Some of those guys certainly have a shot. Defensively, Rubio, Mills, Cross, Rubio, Burnham, Young, Patelho, Traore, all have chances to be NFL players. Linebacker, Jack Kaiser will get drafted. Drake Bowen's an NFL player. Jaden Osbury will have a shot to be an NFL player. Jalen Sneed has a shot to be an NFL player. Kingston will be an NFL player. Cornerback, Benjamin Morrison, Leonard Moore, Christian Gray, all NFL players. Safety, Xavier Watts will get drafted. I think Adon gets drafted. Two deep, Rod Hurd, maybe. And then, who's your fourth guy? That I don't know. Jordan Clark has a shot to make an NFL team, maybe. It's a little small. But, that's a pretty high percentage. Here's where I think the difference is right now. So let's say Notre Dame, in 4 years, we look back at Notre Dame's roster from 2024. And let's say that their NFL talent or the NFL players from that class is 80 to 85%. Let's say it's somewhere in that 80 to 90 that you talk about. The difference between the Notre Dame team in 2024 and those Ohio State teams and that Florida State team from 2013 is Notre Dame still needs to improve sort of the elite level of the talent that they have. Now, Notre Dame had some guys that were elite college players that didn't become elite NFL players, and that's totally fine. I don't care about that. If you're like a Xavier Watts, you're not going to tell me there was a safety that you would trade for Xavier Watts last year if you're just looking at playing college football. If you're talking about would I trade him for another safety if I'm trying to build my NFL draft, status where I want more first round picks, well then sure, I'm going to trade him for Malachi Starks and Caleb Downs, or guys that'll probably get drafted a lot higher, especially Caleb Downs. But there still is a level where, especially on the defensive line, where there's still not this, and you could say the same thing about wide receiver to a degree, where there's still not that same level of elite, top of the board, game-changing talent. I think Ohio State's secondary from 15 probably has more high draft picks, but I don't know that they necessarily have better football players. I think there were some guys from that Ohio State team that were drafted higher because they're from Ohio State and because a lot of them played on the title team from the year before than what maybe where they should have been drafted. And I think the NFL careers they had somewhat reflects that. I don't think your NFL career reflects what kind of college player you were, but I think you can look at where a guy gets drafted and say that I think he was overdrafted based on how his career went. And I felt that about some of those Ohio State guys in that 2015 secondary. But when you look at just kind of overall the talent, I just think there's still a level at some positions where those teams are putting out a lot more high-level players. I think Notre Dame can match any of those teams along the offensive line, tight end. I think we'll see that at running back in future years, linebacker, maybe the secondary at some point in time. But you look at those teams, you had a 5-star Heisman Trophy, national champion, number 1 overall draft pick player quarterback. You had a lot of second-round defensive linemen. You had Mario Edwards and Eddie Goldman, if you guys remember those guys. You had Timmy Jernigan on that 2013 team, that title team, who was a heck of a player, second-round draft. That's 3 defensive linemen that were second-round draft picks. Notre Dame still doesn't have that kind of defensive line talent. Really good college players, but let's be honest, as much as I love a Riley Leonard and a Howard Cross, I can look at them and say, man, great players, but boy, wouldn't it have been nice to have a Jalen Carter and understand the difference between those two types of players. And so if there's an area where Notre Dame can continue to improve, it's going to be there. It's going to be those first, second round talents that they have. I think I'd be foolish to not acknowledge that. So that's the thing, John, is my team may be at 85% are two deeps in the NFL. Your team may be 85% of your team is in the NFL. The difference between the two rosters, however, is going to be I had a bunch of first, second, and third round picks. You had a bunch of 4 through 7 round picks, and my first through thirds then went to the NFL and played like it. But that's kind of where I think the biggest gap between them is I could certainly see 80, 90%. I totally buy that. If we're doing a buy, sell, hold submission, and you were to say Notre Dame's roster is trending towards those teams and the two deep will be 80, 90% of thoughts, I'll buy that. But in a mailbag type setting, I can say, but that's only part of the story. From a contextual standpoint, I believe that they are still lacking some of that elite high-level talent that you need at certain positions. And I talked about Florida State. I think an even better example is Ohio State, because when you look at some of the players they have, I mean, they had number 3 overall draft pick, number 4 overall draft pick. I mean, Darren Lee was a top 20 pick at linebacker, was I think overdrafted. Denzel Ward was a backup on that team, I believe, a young backup on the team. He became a first-round draft pick. You had second-round draft pick at wide receiver, third-round draft pick at D tackle. Some other guys that played on that team ended up becoming high draft picks on the D line. So, that's the difference right there. Is those teams had the really high level elite talent at those key positions that Notre Dame still needs to ideally get to. Now, you can win a title without that, no question. Ohio State didn't win a title in 15 because they got outplayed by a team like Michigan State. But if we're comparing just rosters and draft talent, that would be the difference, in my opinion. Salty Virginia Peanuts, how will the Lady Irish basketball perform in the NCAA tournament, and how far will they go? I tell you, Salty, I don't know. I mean, right now they're not playing good basketball. I think they've lost I think 3 of their last 4. Let me pull up their schedule. They lost 2 in a row late in the year, and then of course they lost in the second quarterfinals of the semifinals of the ACC tournament. So they have to get some things going. And I got to tell you, like, some things I noticed watching them lately. Let me pull up their schedule. They lost 3 of their last 5. They beat Louisville last game of the regular season, then beat Cal in the quarterfinals, and then lost to Duke in the semifinals. But when you look at some of these games they lost, a couple things that stand out. In some of those games, their defense was just really subpar. But what I've noticed in a lot of these games is they don't have the same movement. They're not pushing the tempo the same way that they were at times when they were really rolling. I mean, they like to get out and run. I wasn't seeing as much of that. Shots were coming up short. That tells me maybe they had a little bit higher, a little bit heavy legs in the ACC tournament. I didn't see that in the 2 losses against Florida State and NC State, but you could definitely see that against Duke. Just not a lot. I mean, you'd see girls picking up the ball and like nobody's except Olivia Miles is running to the ball, and Hannah's doing more kind of complaining to the officials than she is playing basketball. I think that's something that's kind of a little bit of a factor. And I don't know that they're really have figured out how to run the offense through the post the way I think they need to when they can't get out and run. And you've got a lot of studs in that lineup trying to find their way on how to play together. I'm going to say something that some of y'all may not agree with, and I'm curious to see who does. I honestly think the best thing to happen to this team is that they got knocked out when they did. I know that sounds crazy, but there's 2 reasons why I say that. Number one, I think that the extra time is going to be beneficial. It's only like an extra day or 2, but the other thing is I think there's a little bit of motivation for that team that, they thought they were pretty good, and then they kind of falter down the stretch. And I'll tell you what it reminds me a lot of, because when does the NCAA tournament start? The last time they played was on March 8th. When does the NCAA women's basketball tournament schedule? Let me see when that starts. I know it's this week sometime. Did it already? No, that's Ivy League tournament. So when's the first round start? It looks like it starts on, this graphic's not pulling up. First round starts on March 21st. That means they're going to have 13 days between their last game and their next game. I think that rest is going to do huge for them in regard to getting their legs back. If they can then get back to playing good defense and smart defense and moving the basketball and pushing the tempo, I think they're a Final Four team. I mean, the team that we saw just ripping people up, that's still there. They just kind of lost their way. And the team that they reminded me a lot of, and it's a different situation, but I remember that Michigan men's team back in 2012 and 13, that Trey Burke team. And as you guys know, I used to be a Michigan basketball fan, really big Michigan basketball fan. But I remember that team, and I remember how good they were to start the year. They got all the way up to number 1. I think it's actually got up to number 2. They were 16-0, and they lost at Ohio State. I still remember that game because we were having a recruiting visit that day, and we were in the cafeteria at Defiance watching that game. Then they won their next 4. Then they got up to number 1. They beat Northwestern. Then they lost on the road at Indiana. And then they were 20-1, but they went into the tournament 26-7 because they lost. They went 5-5 down the stretch of the regular season after starting 20-1. And then they went 1-1 in the tournament and got whipped by Wisconsin. And they looked tired. They just didn't look like the same team. And then they went into the NCAA tournament, whipped South Dakota State, blew out VCU, had a huge one over Kansas, blew out Florida, beat Syracuse, and then lost to Louisville in a game that I still think they got screwed to this day. So that team needed that sort of, they were feeling good about themselves, and they needed that sort of humility down the stretch. And then, of course, the break in between the Big Ten tournament and when the NCAA tournament started to kind of regroup, get their legs back, and figure some things out, find some answers. And then John Beilein was able to get them rolling. So just because you started the season finish the season poorly doesn't mean that that's going to carry over into the tournament. But the top coaches find ways to get them out of those funks. And that's what this team has. That's what Coach Ivey and the staff have to figure out. They have to figure out how to do that. And if they can do that, I think this team can still go very far. I still love this basketball team. It's still a very talented basketball team. That hasn't changed at all. We just got to see them get back to being the team that they were when they were really rolling. So if they can do that, they'll be fine, and they'll have a chance to get back to the Final Four. I mean, let's not forget, the team that won the title lost to Louisville in the ACC championship. So, I mean, just because you lose late, now they only lost that one game, but remember that year Louisville owned them. Louisville beat them twice. And then UConn beat them in the regular season. And then they got a rematch against UConn in the semifinals and Final Four, I should say, and beat them. Enrique hit that big shot at the end, and then obviously were able to beat Mississippi State. So I just don't think finishing bad doesn't necessarily mean you can't go, but you do have to find some answers. And you do have to figure out what's the best rotation, how are they using people, and figure that out. But I think they'll get it turned around. Last group of questions here. Let's see here. Salty, what changes will Mike Martin make in the recruiting process? That I don't know, Salty. That's still that's still definitely a big question mark. I don't know the answer to that yet, and we're going to need to see that soon. We're going to need to see Marcus Freeman getting more involved in recruiting very soon. I haven't heard his name mentioned as much. I haven't seen that grind as much from him this offseason, which is a little bit concerning, but it's still early. We're going to have to see. It's honest. Like, honestly, with guys with a lot of recruiting questions that are more big picture in nature, not, hey, what are your thoughts on this kid? What are your thoughts on that kid? But a lot of these bigger picture questions about the class and Freeman and Martin, talk to me again in May when we've had a chance to see them go through the spring visits. Then I'll have a better sense of the answer to that question, Salty. Next question from Salty. Which quarterback in contention to be quarterback QB1 has the best personality to thrive in the spotlight that comes with being the Notre Dame quarterback? I think all of them have that, to be honest with you. I think they all have the personality to be that. That's one of the reasons that I'm so confident in this room is from a mentality standpoint, a personality standpoint. I think they're all very likable. I think Steve is very likable. CJ's very likable. Kenny's very likable. I think they're all comfortable in front of the media. They've all grown to become more comfortable in some areas. I don't know that I've seen a lot of CJ in those settings, but he's always looked comfortable when he has been. Kenny's a very fun-loving kid that people really like to be around and talk to from a media standpoint. And then, of course, Steve he's the one that has the personality that's the most proven in those settings, and he's a very confident kid. But I think they all have the personality to thrive in that scenario. I don't know that there's one who's better suited than the others outside of just Steve having more experience at it. Salty also asked, what role and influence did Pete Vivacqua have in the ESPN ACC negotiations? I couldn't tell you to what degree, but I do know that he was involved in that process. And what I don't know was he in that process from the standpoint of he was kind of a big-time mover and shaker in the negotiations, or was he behind the scenes with Jim Phillips talking? Was he talking to ESPN? I don't know the specifics, but I do know for a fact that Pete Vivacqua, much like Jack Swarbrick, has been very influential and very involved in a lot of these conversations with the playoff committee, with the ACC. Look, one of the things that came out of the deal with the ACC and ESPN was the stuff about they're going to play Notre Dame more. Clemson, Florida State, Miami are going to play Notre Dame more. That doesn't happen without Notre Dame's permission. They can't just change the schedule with Notre Dame without Notre Dame's permission. Notre Dame would not be very happy about that. So when you hear things like that, you know that Notre Dame is there. And you go back to a comment that Pete Vivacqua made before all that went down, where he talked about we'd love to play Clemson and we'd love to develop a rivalry with Clemson. That comment doesn't happen, and then just because I don't know, I just feel like saying this. And then lo and behold, sometime later, it comes out that Notre Dame's going to play Clemson, Florida State, Miami more often. Shocker. Well, that's because Pete Vivacqua knows what he wants. He knows what's going to help his program. He knows what's going to help the ACC. He knows that more games against those teams means better TV revenue for the league. which means better contracts with ESPN, which means more potential sustainability within that program or within that conference. So you know that Pete's got his hands all in that. To what degree, I couldn't tell you. But because I just don't know him very well. I don't know people around. I don't know him at all. I don't know people around him as well as I did some people that were around Jack Swarbrick. So a lot of specifics I can tell you, but I have heard enough from people to know that he was very involved in that. And then I can see with my own eyes, what's getting done. And last question from Salty, and I think this is the last question overall from that group. Do we have another super chat? Oh, we have another super chat that we'll get to, I believe. But Salty says, how has Max Bulla handled the role of primary recruiter for the LB position? He's been fine. I mean, he was a big part of the recruiting process last year with Madden and Anthony Sacca. Obviously, Al Golden was involved in it as well with Sacca, but he's doing well. The players seem to like him, and I think he's still kind of getting a little bit used to some of the daily grind of it. But from what I've heard so far, it sounds like he's doing a good job with that and has a lot of potential as a coach. So let me just get to here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. We do have a super chat. Oh, we already answered that one. Let's see here. All right, these are the last couple. These are some good ones. All right, so Joseph, go Salty. We'll go to Joseph last. Go Salty says, which receiver other than Malachi Fields and Jaden Greathouse has the highest potential to have a breakout season? Jordan Faison. I think he's the most established. My next in line would be Will Pauling. Those guys are both very established. I think those two guys have a chance to be really good football players. The question is, can Jordan Faison stay healthy and can he do it consistently? But I think if he's healthy and he's around more this spring, and I think he's got a chance to be a really good football player for Notre Dame. You got to find the right role for him. There's just some things he doesn't do incredibly well. So what you got to do as a coach is you've got to find more ways to get him the football. And the one thing I think works for Jordan is the quarterbacks that are going to be competing for the starting job are a little bit better with some of the stuff that he's good at. And I think he's a guy that could benefit from the new batch of quarterbacks. Not that it's not a knock on Riley. It's just that's true for a lot of quarterbacks. So I think he's the guy that I'd go him and then Pauling. And then after that, probably Micah Gilbert. Probably after that, then KK, then Cam Smith or Cam Williams, and then probably Logan Saldate would be the order of highest potential to have a breakout this year. Based on opportunity, experience, all those type of things. Not just on talent, but there's more to it than that. Nick McGrail, do you think 7-on-7 is more helpful or hurtful to the development of a running back, wide receiver, DB, quarterback, linebacker? I will say this. I think in some ways 7-on-7 is incredibly helpful to young players. I think that 7-on-7 is incredibly helpful to young players at quarterback to a degree. It's incredibly helpful for wide receivers. In that they have to focus so much more on their craft. I think it's really good for defensive backs who have to play a lot more man coverage. I think it's good for linebackers who really got to work on, making zone reads and making run game or pass game reads and things along those lines. Running back, I don't think it does much of anything outside of, unless you're letting the guy just really get out there and catch the football. But there's also, some positives, some negatives. I would much rather see 7-on-7 stuff be more geared towards, their high school teams. I don't love the national part of it because I would like to see, guys kind of running what they do a little bit more, maybe more in-state type of stuff. The national stuff is fine. But there's also the notion that you learn bad habits playing in 7-on-7 also. And if they were more run by through a more structured team type of setting, as opposed to it being more of a 7-on-7 league type of setting, then, it can be problematic because you're learning bad habits. So receiver is going to try to do some things in a 7-on-7 to win that he would never do in a game because he won't have the room to work with, or he might get drilled. A quarterback is going to feel a certain way. He's going to get kind of rushing his reads or whatever because you're doing a one Mississippi type of thing where you got to get the ball out certainly quickly. So I think the drawback is that in these national 7-on-7 type of tournaments and where you're not necessarily always in the same team, a lot of them are, some of them aren't, you're learning some bad habits also. And if they were done in more of a structured way, I think they'd be even more beneficial. But the opportunities to play more football and compete against other talented players and teams and just continue to hone your craft there's always a lot of benefits to that. I just wish they could find ways to get some of the negatives out of it. And you've got a lot of these 7-on-7 coaches that aren't really teaching the game. It's all about them winning and their egos and attitudes. And so as long as they're winning, they don't really care as much about, are we teaching kids certain things that are applicable to doing this at the next level? And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on it. Ball Peen Shillelagh, of all the quarterbacks Notre Dame plays against this coming season, who is 1, the most overrated, 2, the most underrated, and 3, the most skilled? That's a great question. Let me pull up Notre Dame's 2025 football schedule. I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to the most overrated. I think you guys are going to know my answer on that one. So that would be old Carson Beck. Let me look through some of the other quarterbacks that they're going to play. I wouldn't call him. I don't know that I'd put him in any of these. He's not underrated, overrated. I don't think he's the most skilled, but I'll tell you a kid that's really fun to watch that I'm very curious to see what he's going to do in his first full year as a starter is the kid from NC State, CJ Bailey. I saw him come off the bench late last year against Clemson, and he really impressed me. Was he a true freshman or a redshirt freshman? Give me 1 second. I want to find that out because, yeah, he was a true freshman this year for NC State. Threw for 2,400 yards, ran for 279 yards, had 17 passing touchdowns, 10 picks, 5 rushing touchdowns. But I saw him come off the bench against Clemson and lead that offense up and down the field. Had a couple 300-yard games there. Had a 300-yard game against Syracuse, a 300-yard game against Cal. Had a really, really impressive performance against North Carolina in a late comeback win. Had some really big-time plays late against Georgia Tech, but also had a lot of turnovers, so you started to see some of the youth there. So he went from 18 to 20 for 234 yards and 3 touchdowns against Stanford, 90% completion rate. To a week later, he's 17 of 30 or 16 of 39 for 184 yards and 4.7 per attempt against Duke. So you saw a lot of that true freshman, looks like a true freshman from him. But I got to tell you, that kid's got a lot of tools. Obviously, this year is more comfortable kind of playing out of off script a little bit, scrambling around. I think a year under his belt, where he gets to learn the system more, be more experienced. You're going to see him be able to be even more impactful from the pocket. I think that kid's got a chance to be really good. He's a kid you could maybe be in the conversation for most skilled. I'd want to watch him just a little bit more before I go there, but he's in the conversation for most skilled. Let me go through the roster. That's a kid I like a lot. Jaden Maeva, he's okay. Dylan Lonergan's got a lot of talent. He's got a lot of talent. I love Ricky Collins. There's a lot of good quarterbacks that Notre Dame's going to face this year. The Brown kid, Elijah Brown, if he wins the job at Stanford's a nice young quarterback. The Green kid at Arkansas is a talented quarterback. He's a bit raw, and needs to stay healthy. I think Marcel Reed's overrated, but I don't think he's as overrated as Carson Beck is. He'd be my most overrated. Most underrated. Oh, and of course you've got the Horvath kid at Navy's back, so he's a really good quarterback too. So they're going to play some, Ricky Collins at Syracuse, Eli, Holstein at Pitt. It's a really talented player. They're going to play some good quarterbacks this year. Dylan Lonergan at BC. Quarterback schedule is pretty decent this year. It really is. So it's a good quarterback schedule. Who is the most underrated on there? I would have to probably go with – I'm going to go with the kid at Navy. And I know he got some hype this year, but he kind of got overshadowed a little bit by the kid at Army. And I also think the fact that he was injured for part of the year hurt his perception a lot as well. But I thought he was a really impressive kid. 1,300 passing yards, 13 touchdowns, over 1,200 rushing yards, 17 touchdowns. And that's with him missing a couple games. And then he was banged up. So he got knocked out of the Tulane game early. I think he got initially banged up against – he was banged up coming into the Notre Dame game. He had a hand issue or something. And then he was a little bit banged up, got knocked out of the Tulane game, missed the East Carolina game. Could tell he wasn't himself against Army fully, but he still was great in that game, played great against Oklahoma. He's a guy that doesn't get the kind of hype that I think he should get. He's a really, really dynamic player. So I'd say he is a guy that's very underrated. I don't want to put CJ Bailey in that conversation. I'll tell you a guy that I used to think was super overrated coming out of high school that I think has kind of fallen into where he should be is Eli Holstein. I don't think he gets the hype he got coming out of high school because he left Bam. He's now at Pitt. But he was a quality player for them this year in his first year as a starter. Had some really good games early. They hit a bit of a rough patch offensively, kind of in the middle of the season. O-line wasn't playing great. Some teams kind of figured out what they were trying to do. But you saw what happened to them when he got hurt. I mean, when he got hurt, they were 7-1. He played against Virginia. I think that's the game he got knocked out of. He only threw 5 passes the rest of the year, and they lost to Toledo in the bowl game. They lost to Boston College. They got killed by Louisville. They got beat at home by Clemson. In the game he didn't play. If he plays, maybe they win that game. But I've come to really appreciate him for who he is now without take the hype out of the conversation. And I always thought he was overhyped. But he's a quality quarterback. There's no doubt he's a quality quarterback. So this is a really good quarterback schedule for Notre Dame, much better than we saw last year. Underrated. I'm Horvath. I'm comfortable with that one. Overrated, Carson Beck, most skilled. Most skilled's a little bit of a different, maybe CJ Bailey. Maeva's got some talent, but he's really got some unorthodox to him. Holstein's got some skill. I think Ricky Collins has got a lot of skill. So those guys in the economy, I'll say CJ Bailey. I'll go with him. I think I'll go with him as the most skilled. Really talented young quarterback. But again, he's a true freshman this past year. So it's hard to put too much on him. And then Joseph Barrett, this will be the last one of the saved ones I had from earlier. And then I got a couple that have popped up here as we've gone in the show. But Joseph Barrett says, how important was Chuck Martin to the early years of Brian Kelly? Did he take over the defense after the Navy loss in 2010? No, Bob Diaco still ran the defense in 2010. Chuck Martin was incredibly important. He gave that team a lot of, he was a great coach, right? I mean, you're talking about a guy that was a defensive coordinator at Grand Valley State, became a head coach and won titles at Grand Valley State, was a defensive backs coach at Notre Dame, who then became the offensive coordinator on the team that went 12-0. I think he just provided some stability. You know, where Brian Kelly was such a volatile type of person, Chuck was sort of the anti-Brian Kelly, and I think that's part of the reason Brian Kelly brought him on, which is smart. He's a guy that recruited well. He's a guy that players respected. He was also very demanding. He's a smart football coach, could do a lot of different things. So I think he was very important to that early success. And obviously the job he did, just really bringing some maturity and consistency to the offense in 2012. They were never dynamic offensively. I mean, you had a game here, a game there, but it wasn't that they were dynamic. It's just more that he just brought some stability to the table. And just some, you had Brian Kelly being the aggressive in your face, screaming at everybody. And then Chuck was a little bit different. Not that Chuck was anyway, like not an intense guy, but he's more of a coach and not just a screamer. And I thought he brought some of that. So I will always value the contributions that Chuck Martin brought to that football team as an assistant coach. Absolutely. He did a phenomenal job. Archer 452. These are the last two questions that we'll get to here before we get out of here, unless you guys have some other questions you want to get in here before I go. But I got this question from Archer 452. Which Notre Dame player that is currently unknown to the larger college football fan base will be a household name by the end of 2025? That's a really good question. I would not put CJ Carr in that conversation because I think that he's a name that people kind of know. Obviously, people saw Jaden Greathouse at the end of the year. Leonard Moore got a lot of pub. Okay, I got two for you. I'll go one offense, one defense, and I'll give you my pick, and then I'll give you my next in line pick. My pick on offense is Malachi Fields. I think he's a guy that nobody knows a lot about because he played at Virginia. Nobody cares about Virginia and kind of what they're doing. He's a very good football player. Now that he's got sort of the brand power around him and a much better quarterback play, I think Malachi Fields is a guy that's going to be a very important player for Notre Dame. And a guy that, not that he's going to have look at his numbers compared to Jeremiah Smith. It's not going to be that. But a guy that just a lot of people are going to know a lot more about and be more of a household name because I think he will be sort of 1A, 1B with Jaden Greathouse in the pass game. And that's going to be a much improved part of this team. And I think this team is going to be very good. My runner-up to that is Charles Jagasaw, and you could easily make a case for Charles Jagasaw being number one, but guy's got 2 career starts. He's only really played in 3 games, so I just need to see a little bit more. But and I wrote about this today. I think Charles Jagasaw could be a star next year. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself on that because, again, he's only made 2 starts and he's only played in 3 games where he's played meaningful snaps. But even in those 3 games, you just saw a guy with a lot of talent and a lot of ability, and a guy that played at a pretty darn high level. And the only 2 games he played against this year were against 2 of the best defensive lines in college football, and he more than held his own in those games and had some very, very excellent moments. So he's sort of my runner-up, and if I saw more of him, you could easily go with him. Defensively, I think Drake Bowen is going to be a guy that I don't know that a lot of people outside of Notre Dame know a whole lot about. I think there's even some Notre Dame fans who have a very negative opinion of Drake. I still don't understand why that is. I think he was really, really good this year when you consider his, like, in the context of being a redshirt sophomore that had played not even 100 snaps on defense the year before to become the kind of player he was. I think he's going to have a breakout year next year. And there's several linebackers I think could kind of be in that conversation too. The other guy that's not a household name right now that I think will be by next, and maybe this is more that I hope is a household name by the end of next year, is Boubacar Traore. I think he's a guy that I could see being a household name that not a lot of people outside of Notre Dame know about, that I could see being that next year, Archer. So that's a really good question. And I appreciate that question coming from someone who's not a Notre Dame fan. Because I think, you know about certain things because you're on our show all the time, but I bet you if you started talking about some guys that we talk about a lot to other Ohio State fans, they'd be like, I don't know who that guy is. Like, who's that guy? So, yeah, that would be one for me. All right, so let's get to this last one. This is a super chat from DK. 100% for the effort. Well, 50% after YouTube takes their cut. Yes, very, very true. Very, very true. So I thank you for that, DK. So that's our show, everybody. Kind of got to almost 3 hours today. Did it in a little bit of a different way, and I'm sorry that more people weren't able to be in this show since we kind of put it together last minute. But I'm glad that I was able to get those questions answered. I'm glad that I was able to kind of spend some time with you. I'm glad I have power back, and I'm so happy we bought a new fridge last year when we had to do those renovations in our house because of the flooding, because it's a great fridge. And we had power out for all 2.5 hours. And when I opened up the fridge after it turned back on, because I don't open it when it's on, and it was still the same temperature that it was when it shut. And when we had a power outage, a couple of years last summer, and then the year before that, our fridge didn't last that long where it would be the same temperature for that long. So was happy about that. Happy we got power back. I'm going to go have some chili here for dinner here now that the show's over. So I'm going to go get that done and have a great day. I still plan on being back tomorrow at 1:00. That's my plan as of right now. I'll let you guys know if that plan changes. Just to talk a little bit about the defense, and then we'll be back Monday with an RTCF show, and then Trevor will be back hopefully by Tuesday. He's feeling a little bit better today, not quite out of the woods yet, but he did go to the doctor. Just got the flu, and he's feeling a little bit better. He was actually kind of emceeing the show a little bit earlier. And he'll be back at it on Tuesday when we get back rocking and rolling. So have a great weekend, everybody. I hope I'll see some of y'all tomorrow on Saturday. For those who we won't, we'll see you back on Monday. But hit that like, hit that subscribe, hit the notification bell. Give us a 5-star review on your podcast app. We would really, really appreciate that. And, of course, the best way to support Irish Breakdown is always signing up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Have an awesome day, everybody. And we'll talk to you again here very, very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.